The private dining room at Meridian was everything Vanessa Collins had requested: candlelight champagne on ice, and every important person in her life seated and waiting. She stood at the head of the table, glass raised, and smiled at Ryan Carter across the room. He had driven over in that old truck of his, wearing the same plain jacket he always wore. She had chosen this restaurant, carefully chosen, this moment carefully, and chosen the man now seated beside her, Blake Harrison, just as carefully. What Vanessa had not chosen, and could not have predicted, was that every single person working in that room answered to Ryan. Ryan Carter did not look like a man who owned anything. That was perhaps the most accurate thing anyone could say about him. He drove a truck that was 7 years old, wore jeans that had seen better days, and kept his watch, a simple stainless steel one, on his left wrist without drawing attention to it. When people met him for the first time, they usually assumed he worked with his hands for a living, which was not entirely wrong. He had built everything he owned with them, just not in the way most people imagined. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quietness that some people mistook for shyness and others mistook for emptiness. He had lost his wife 6 years earlier, and that loss had settled into him the way long grief does, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. It had changed the way he moved through the world. He stopped needing people to know who he was. He stopped needing much at all, except the work and the rare, specific feeling of sitting across from someone who made the noise in his head go quiet. Vanessa Collins had done that for him in the beginning. She was the kind of woman who entered a room and immediately became the center of it, not because she demanded attention, but because she had been trained from childhood to occupy space with confidence. Her father had built a real estate portfolio across 3 states. Her mother had sat on the boards of 2 charitable foundations. Vanessa had grown up understanding that the world sorted people into categories, and that the worst thing you could do was end up in the wrong one. She had founded her tech company at 29, scaled it aggressively, and by the time she met Ryan, she was running a team of over 200 people and closing deals that made her peers take notice. What had drawn her to Ryan in those early months was something she never fully explained, not to her friends, not to her family, and perhaps not even to herself. He was different from the men in her circle. He listened without interrupting. He did not talk about money or status or positioning. He asked her questions about things that had nothing to do with her company or her ambitions, and he seemed genuinely interested in the answers. For a while, that had felt like relief, but relief for people like Vanessa had a shelf life. Her mother had never approved. Her father had been politely dismissive in the way wealthy men are when they consider someone beneath their attention. Her closest friends, the ones who attended the same fundraisers and frequented the same summer homes, had exchanged glances when Ryan's name came up and said things like, "He seems sweet," which was the most damning thing they knew how to say. Over time, the weight of those opinions had settled into Vanessa differently than she expected, not as pressure exactly, more like a slow confirmation of something she had already started to believe on her own. Ryan, for his part, had noticed the shift. He was not a man who missed things. He had simply chosen not to name them because naming them would have required a conversation he was not ready to have about a relationship. He was not ready to lose, even as it was already becoming something else entirely. There were evenings when Vanessa would look at him across a restaurant table with an expression that was almost clinical, as though she were measuring something and finding it short. He had noticed that, too. He had filed it away in the same quiet place he filed everything that hurt without announcing itself. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Ryan was in his office on the 3rd floor of the building he technically did not appear to own, at least not on any document that carried his name publicly. The office was plain: a desk, a laptop, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the street below. His assistant manager at Meridian, a sharp and loyal man named Derek Webb, called him directly rather than sending a message. Derek had been with Ryan for 9 years. He knew when something needed to be handled carefully, and he knew when it needed to be handled immediately. This was both. He told Ryan that a reservation had come in for the following Saturday evening. A private dining room, maximum capacity, full service. The name on the reservation was Vanessa Collins. The occasion listed in the notes field read, "A new beginning for Vanessa." Derek read it twice to make sure he had it right. Ryan asked him to read it a third time. Then he asked Derek to send him the full guest list. It arrived within the hour. Ryan read through it slowly, the way he read contracts, not looking for what was there, but for what the arrangement of everything revealed. Vanessa's mother, Patricia Collins. Her father, Gerald Collins. 3 of her closest friends' women Ryan had met at dinners and said little to. 2 of her business partners. And near the bottom of the list, a name Ryan recognized from a different context, entirely Blake Harrison. Blake Harrison ran a private equity firm that had been mentioned twice in publications Ryan followed for industry reasons. He was the kind of man who showed up in rooms like Meridian without needing a reservation because someone always made the call for him. Ryan knew the type well. He had at various points in his life been mistaken for that type and had deliberately worked to correct the impression. He set his phone face down on the desk and looked at the window for a long moment. The math was not complicated. The occasion note, the guest list, the presence of Blake Harrison, the absence of any other possible explanation. Ryan had been with Vanessa long enough to understand exactly what Saturday evening was designed to be. He was not going to be a guest at that dinner. He was going to be the reason for it. What surprised him was not the betrayal. People end relationships. They do it badly sometimes and publicly sometimes, and this was both. But it was still at its core something he could understand. What surprised him was the location. Of all the restaurants in this city, Vanessa had chosen Meridian. He wondered if she had chosen it because it was the best, or because she knew he liked it and thought that detail would make the ending sharper. He suspected it was the first reason. He suspected she had no idea at all. He called his attorney that afternoon. Her name was Judith Hale, and she had been managing the legal architecture of Ryan's business interests for 11 years. She was methodical, blunt, and had an instinct for exactly how much information to share at exactly the right moment. Ryan told her what he knew. He told her about the dinner, about Blake Harrison, and about the note on the reservation. Judith listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him she wanted to run a full review of the asset structures before the weekend, not because she expected problems, but because she wanted to be certain there were none. Ryan agreed. She also told him that if he wanted to act preemptively, she could begin drafting the paperwork immediately. Ryan told her he did not want to act preemptively. She asked him why. He told her he wanted to see how the evening was designed to go before he decided how it would actually end. Judith said nothing for a moment, which for her was the equivalent of a long speech. Then she said she understood, and that she would be available Saturday if he needed her. Ryan spent the rest of the week continuing as he always did. He answered emails. He reviewed vendor contracts for 2 of his other properties. He had lunch with a commercial real estate broker about a space he was considering in the northern part of the city. He did not call Vanessa more or less than usual. He did not behave differently. He was on the surface a man with nothing unusual on his mind, which was, he had found over the years, the most useful thing a person could be. Vanessa, in the meantime, was preparing with the kind of precision she brought to everything she considered important. She had called the restaurant herself to confirm the private room. She had selected the menu in advance, going back and forth with the events coordinator over 3 separate emails until every course reflected the standard she expected. She had told her mother the evening was going to be a new chapter, which Patricia Collins had understood immediately and approved of, with the enthusiasm she reserved for decisions that aligned with what she had always believed should have happened sooner. Blake Harrison had been introduced to Vanessa's circle 3 months earlier at a reception for a technology investment forum. He was polished in the way that comes from decades of calculated self-presentation, well-dressed, well-spoken, and skilled at making the person across from him feel that their full attention was the only gift worth having. Vanessa's friends had liked him immediately. Her father had shaken his hand and held it a half-second longer than usual, which in Gerald Collins's vocabulary was an endorsement. Vanessa had told herself that dinner was simply a formal ending to something that had already ended quietly, that she was doing Ryan the courtesy of a proper goodbye rather than a slow fade. She had rehearsed the words she would say. She had thought carefully about tone, not unkind, but clear. She wanted Ryan to understand that it was not about him as a person. It was about direction. It was about where she was going and what that future required. She had told this version of the story to herself so many times that she had started to believe it completely. What she had not done at any point in the planning was wonder whether Ryan knew something she did not. It had not occurred to her that the man she was about to leave quietly with champagne and candlelight and a carefully chosen audience might already be several steps ahead of her. She had looked at Ryan Carter for years and seen exactly what she expected to see. It had never crossed her mind that expectation could be the most expensive thing a person carries. By Friday evening, Judith Hale had completed her review and called Ryan with the results. Every asset was structured cleanly and separately. There was no exposure. There was no risk. Everything Ryan had built over the course of 20 years was exactly where it had always been. Protected, layered, and entirely invisible to anyone who had never thought to look. Ryan thanked her and asked if she would be at Meridian by 8 o'clock Saturday evening. Judith said she would. He told her to bring the ownership documents for the property, not all of them, just the ones that mattered most, and told the clearest story. She asked him how he wanted the evening to go. He told her he wanted it to go exactly the way Vanessa had planned, right up until the moment it didn't. He hung up and sat in the quiet of his office for a while. Outside, the city moved the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, unconcerned with any one person's Saturday evening. Ryan thought about the years he and Vanessa had spent together. He thought about the early dinners, the long drives, the particular way she laughed when something caught her off guard. He thought about the moment he had first understood she was beginning to see him differently, not as a person who surprised her, but as a problem that needed to be resolved. He was not angry. That was the thing he kept returning to quietly in the space between his thoughts. He was not angry at all. He was something closer to tired of being looked at and not seen, tired of the assumption that a man's worth could be read from the outside of him like a label on a box. He had lived with that assumption long enough to stop being wounded by it. But he had not quite made peace with the fact that Vanessa, who had once seemed so different, had turned out to carry it just as deeply as everyone else. Saturday would answer the questions he had not yet found a way to ask. And Ryan Carter, for all his quietness, had learned a long time ago how to wait for the right moment with the patience of someone who already knew how the room was going to turn. Meridian opened its doors at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening, the same as any other night. The front staff had been briefed by Derek Webb that a private event would occupy the east dining room for the full evening. The kitchen had received the menu selections 3 days in advance. The sommelier had pulled the requested bottles that morning and arranged them in the order they would be needed. The flowers on the private room table had been changed out twice before 5 o'clock because the events coordinator wanted them exactly right. From the outside, everything looked exactly like what Vanessa Collins had intended it to look like. A flawlessly arranged evening at one of the finest restaurants in the city, designed to mark a transition in her life, with the kind of elegance she believed the moment deserved. Vanessa arrived at 7:15 with Blake Harrison beside her. She wore a deep navy dress, her hair pulled back in a way that was both effortless and clearly considered. Blake wore a charcoal suit and moved through the entrance the way men like him always did, as though the space had been arranged specifically for their arrival. The host greeted them by name and led them toward the private room, where the rest of the guests were already seated and the first round of drinks had already been poured. Patricia Collins stood when her daughter entered and kissed her on both cheeks. Gerald Collins nodded approvingly at Blake. In that particular way, he had calibrated enough to communicate everything without requiring words. The room was warm with candlelight, and the hum of conversation settled into something comfortable almost immediately. Vanessa took her place at the head of the table and looked around at the faces she had assembled. With such care, her family, her closest friends, her business partners, and Blake, who sat to her right. Everything was in position. The evening was unfolding exactly as she had rehearsed it. Ryan arrived at 7:45. He had driven himself in the same truck Vanessa had always quietly wished he would replace. He wore a dark jacket over a simple button-down, nothing remarkable, nothing that would cause anyone to look twice on the street. He entered through the main door and walked toward the host stand without hurrying. The host recognized him before he had finished crossing the room. What happened next was small, and it was everything. The host straightened almost imperceptibly and said, "Good evening, Mr. Carter," in a tone that was not the tone reserved for guests. It was the tone reserved for someone the staff understood to be above the usual categories of service. A server passing nearby with a tray gave a slight nod in Ryan's direction. Derek Webb appeared from the back corridor and walked toward him directly, not to escort him to a table, but to speak with him the way an employee speaks to the person responsible for the entire operation. They exchanged a few words near the entrance, Ryan nodding once Derek making a note on the small pad he kept in his jacket pocket, and then Ryan made his way toward the east dining room. The door to the private room was open. Ryan stepped into the frame of it and stood there for exactly a moment, long enough for the room to register him, not long enough to seem theatrical. Vanessa looked up from her conversation, and her expression shifted through three things in rapid succession: recognition, surprise, and then a careful reconstruction of composure. She had not expected him this early. She had not expected him to walk in looking entirely unbothered by where he was. "Ryan," she said, keeping her voice light, "you made it." He said that he had, and he took the empty seat that had been placed for him at the far end of the table. The seat that, by the arrangement Vanessa had designed, positioned him as far from the center of the evening as physically possible. He did not appear to notice, or if he noticed, he did not appear to care. He poured himself a glass of water, greeted the people nearest to him by name, and settled into the seat as though he had sat there 100 times before, which in a different sense he had. Patricia Collins leaned toward her daughter and said something beneath the general noise of the table. Vanessa nodded once without looking at her mother. Blake Harrison glanced down the length of the table at Ryan with the measured expression of a man who had been briefed on the situation and was confident in his position within it. Gerald Collins did not look at Ryan at all, which was its own kind of statement. The first course arrived. The conversation at the table moved the way it does when people are performing a version of themselves louder than necessary, more certain than they feel, layered with small demonstrations of connection and status. Blake spoke about a deal he was close to finalizing, and the people who understood what that meant responded with interest, and the people who did not responded with the social equivalent of interest. Vanessa laughed at the right moments. She was good at this. She had been doing it her entire life. Ryan ate his first course and listened. He asked the server a brief question about the preparation of one of the dishes, a quiet, specific question about the sourcing of one of the ingredients, the kind someone asks when they already know the answer and are verifying something else entirely. The server answered him and then did something that no one at the table was prepared for. She addressed him by name again, not "Sir," not the generic courtesy extended to guests, but by name, with the same subtle adjustment in register that the host had used at the entrance. Vanessa noticed. She filed it away and kept her expression neutral. The second course came and went. The conversation continued. The evening moved forward with the momentum Vanessa had built into it, and she began to feel cautiously that the disruption of Ryan's calm presence could be managed, that he was simply going to sit there quietly at the end of the table and allow the night to proceed as planned. She refocused her attention on Blake, on her parents, on the natural rhythm of a table that was, by all visible measures, doing exactly what she had intended it to do. Then the kitchen door swung open to allow one of the senior staff through, and the head chef came out with him, not to address the table, but to speak to someone. The chef was a man named Gordon Reeves, who had been with Meridian for 6 years and had twice been recognized in regional publications for his work there. He walked past the guest tables without stopping and went directly to the far end of the private room, where he leaned down and spoke to Ryan in a low voice. Ryan responded. Gordon Reeves nodded with the kind of deference that does not come from politeness alone, and before he turned back toward the kitchen, he said 2 words that carried clearly enough in the brief lull of table noise for several people nearby to hear them without difficulty. "Of course, boss." The lull stretched. Patricia Collins set her fork down slowly. One of Vanessa's business partners glanced sideways at the woman beside her. Blake Harrison's expression did not change, but something behind it did a small recalibration, the kind that happens when a room shifts in a way that hasn't been accounted for. Vanessa looked at Ryan from across the table. He was not looking back at her. He was looking at the dish in front of him with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. "Ryan." Vanessa's voice came out more carefully than she intended. "Do you know the chef here?" Ryan looked up then, and his expression was entirely ordinary. He said that he did that Gordon had been with the restaurant for some time, and that he was excellent at his work. He said it the way someone says something that is completely true, and contains simultaneously a great deal more than it appears to. Then he returned to his meal. Blake Harrison reached for his wine glass and said, in the easy tone of a man re-establishing the direction of a conversation, that the food was exceptional, one of the better meals he'd had in the city. Several people agreed. Gerald Collins said something about the ambiance. The table reformed itself around the moment and kept moving, but Vanessa could not quite settle back into it the way she had before. Something had shifted in the geometry of the room, and she couldn't locate the exact point where it had moved. She told herself Ryan was friendly with the staff. She told herself chefs spoke informally. Sometimes that boss was the kind of word people used loosely in kitchens. She reached for her own glass and looked down the table again. Ryan was speaking to the guest beside him, one of Vanessa's business partners, a woman named Claire Mercer, who had always been pleasant, but never particularly warm toward Ryan. Claire was laughing at something he had said. It was a genuine laugh, not a polite one. Vanessa watched that for a moment longer than she meant to, and something about it, the ease of it, the lack of performance, settled in her chest in a way she did not immediately have a name for. She stood at 8:45 and touched her glass gently to draw the table's attention. The room quieted. This was the moment she had prepared for the words she had chosen and practiced the graceful pivot from one chapter to the next. She smiled at the assembled faces of the people who mattered most to her and began to speak. She talked about growth and about having the courage to be honest about what a person needs. She talked about gratitude for the people who had walked alongside her and the recognition that sometimes paths diverge not out of failure, but out of clarity. She talked about looking forward, about building a future that reflected who she was now rather than who she had been. She was good with language she had spent years learning to deliver difficult things in ways that felt inevitable rather than cruel. The room listened. Blake Harrison rested his hands on the table in a posture of quiet support. Patricia Collins' expression was composed and approving. Ryan listened too. He did not look away. He did not shift in his seat or signal discomfort or perform any of the responses that might have given Vanessa something easier to manage. He simply listened with the same steadiness he had brought to the entire evening, and that steadiness Vanessa was beginning to understand was not passivity. It was something else entirely, something that had weight to it and patience, and a knowledge she had not yet been able to name. She was finishing her final sentence when the door to the private room opened and Judith Hale walked in. Judith was in her early 50s, wearing a gray blazer and carrying a leather folder of the kind that does not appear at dinner parties. She did not excuse herself for the interruption. She did not look at Vanessa, or at Blake, or at any of the guests assembled at the table. She walked directly to Ryan's end of the room and set the folder on the table beside him with the practiced efficiency of someone executing a plan that had been agreed upon days in advance. Vanessa stopped speaking. "I apologize for the timing," Judith said, addressing the room without particular apology in her voice. "But given the occasion, Mr. Carter thought it was appropriate to have these available this evening." She opened the folder and removed a set of documents, clean, formal, tabbed for reference, and placed them in front of Ryan. Then she straightened and stood beside him with her hands folded. Ryan did not reach for the documents immediately. He looked at Vanessa from across the table, and for the first time all evening, he held her gaze without letting it go. "These are the ownership records for Meridian," Judith said in the same level tone, "as well as documentation for the 4 other properties in the Carter Group portfolio operating in this city, and the holding company structure that sits above all of them." She let that land. Then she added with the precision of someone who had spent 11 years choosing exactly which facts to release, and in exactly what order. Mr. Carter is the sole founder and controlling owner. He has been since the restaurant opened 12 years ago. The room did not make a sound. Gerald Collins looked at the documents on the table as though they were in a language he did not speak. Patricia Collins looked at her daughter. Blake Harrison set his wineglass down with a care that suggested his hand needed something to do. Claire Mercer at the far side of the table looked at Ryan with an expression that was moving rapidly from surprise toward something that resembled reassessment. Vanessa stood at the head of the table with her champagne glass still in her hand. The speech she had practiced for weeks was still warm in her throat, and it had nowhere left to go. The restaurant she had chosen for its elegance, for the statement it made about who she was and where she was headed, had been for 12 years a place where every light fixture and every table and every door hinge belonged to the man she had brought here to leave behind. She looked at Ryan. He looked back at her. And in the space between them, which had always been wider than either of them, had admitted the truth of the evening settled into place, not with drama, not with noise, but with the quiet and irreversible weight of something that cannot be taken back once it has been seen. Nobody moved for a long moment. The candles burned. The ambient sound of the main dining room beyond the closed door continued as though nothing had shifted, because out there, nothing had. But inside the private room, the air had changed in the way it does when a truth lands that cannot be reframed or softened or absorbed quietly. It simply sat there on the table beside Judith Hale's documents, occupying the same space as the champagne glasses and the unfinished plates and the careful arrangements Vanessa had made over weeks of planning. Blake Harrison was the first to recover, which said something about him. He picked up his wineglass with a measured ease and said nothing, which was smarter than speaking, and he knew it. Gerald Collins cleared his throat and looked at the documents without reaching for them, as though proximity alone might tell him what they contained. Patricia Collins looked at her daughter with an expression that had moved past surprise into something more complicated, not quite sympathy, not quite accusation, but somewhere in the difficult territory between them. Vanessa set her champagne glass down on the table. Her hand was steady. She had spent enough years in boardrooms and difficult negotiations to know how to keep her body from advertising what her mind was doing. She looked at Judith Hale and said in a voice that was almost entirely controlled that she was not sure what the purpose of this was. Judith said the purpose was clarity, and that Mr. Carter believed the evening called for it. Vanessa looked at Ryan then, and something in her expression shifted the careful composure, thinning slightly at the edges. She said his name, not as an accusation, more as a question she hadn't finished forming yet. Ryan stayed where he was. He did not stand dramatically or raise his voice or reach for the documents himself. He folded his hands on the table in front of him and looked at Vanessa across the length of the room with a steadiness that had nothing aggressive in it and nothing apologetic either. He thanked Judith and told her she could step out, that he would take it from here. Judith collected the folder, left the documentation on the table, and walked out of the room without ceremony. The door closed behind her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Gerald Collins said more to the room than to anyone specific that this was all very surprising. Ryan looked at him briefly and said he imagined it was. There was no edge in it. It was simply an acknowledgement of fact, delivered in the same tone Ryan used for everything, which made it somehow more difficult to respond to than anger would have been. Gerald Collins did not speak again after that. Vanessa moved around the table. She did not make a production of it, but she closed the distance between herself and Ryan's end of the room until she was standing close enough to speak without the whole table hearing every word. The guests watched without pretending not to. Blake Harrison turned his wine glass slowly by the stem and kept his eyes on the table in front of him. She told Ryan she hadn't known. Her voice was lower now, stripped of the rehearsed quality it had carried during her speech. She said that, if she had known the restaurant was his, she never would have, and then she stopped because the sentence had no good ending. She never would have chosen it was the honest completion. She never would have come here, which meant the only thing she was expressing regret about was the location, and she was self-aware enough in that moment to hear how that sounded. Ryan looked at her for a moment before he spoke. He said he knew she hadn't known, and that it didn't change anything either way. He said it gently, which was worse than if he had said it with distance, because gentleness in that context carried a finality that coldness doesn't. Coldness can be argued with. Gentleness that has already arrived at its conclusion cannot. Vanessa said she thought they could talk about this, not here, not tonight, but somewhere. She said that the way things had unfolded was not what she had intended, that it had gotten complicated, and that she had made decisions she might have made differently given more time. Ryan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said quietly that he believed her. He said he thought she was telling the truth about her intentions, and that she probably had reasons for each decision that made sense to her at the time. Then he said the thing that changed the temperature of the room more than anything Judith's documents had accomplished. He told her the restaurant wasn't the issue. He told her that a person could choose any restaurant in any city, and that wouldn't have mattered to him. What mattered, he said, was that she had looked at him for years and seen something incomplete, a project that hadn't scaled properly. A choice she had tolerated longer than was sensible, and that she had never once thought to ask him who he actually was. Not because she was cruel, he said, but because it had genuinely not occurred to her that she might be wrong about him. She had made her assessment early and carried it forward without revisiting it the way people do when the assessment is comfortable, and the alternative requires more from them. And that more than the dinner, more than Blake Harrison, more than the note she had written on the reservation form, that was the thing he had no interest in arguing his way back from. Vanessa stood very still. Around them, the guests at the table had gone quiet in the way that people go quiet when they understand they are witnessing something that is not meant for them and cannot be stopped. Patricia Collins looked down at the tablecloth. Claire Mercer had stopped pretending to look anywhere other than at Ryan. She said his name again, and this time it was neither a question nor a statement. It was something smaller than both an acknowledgement that she had heard him and that hearing him had cost her something she had not budgeted for tonight. Ryan stood up from his chair. He did it without announcement, without drama, the way he did everything. He straightened his jacket, and he looked at Vanessa one more time. Not with coldness, not with satisfaction, not with any of the emotions the room might have expected from a man in his position. What he looked at her with was something closer to honesty, the kind that has finished being painful and arrived at the other side of itself. He told her he hoped the evening went the way she needed it to. Then he said goodnight to the table, not pointedly, not with irony, just the ordinary word a person uses when they're leaving a room, and he walked to the door and opened it and went out into the main dining area of Meridian, where the other guests were finishing their meals and the servers were moving between tables, and the whole ordinary machinery of the restaurant continued without interruption. Derek Webb was near the host stand when Ryan came through. He fell into step beside him without being asked because he had worked with Ryan long enough to read the room. Ryan told him the evening had gone fine, that the kitchen had done well, and that he wanted a note sent to Gordon Reeves in the morning about the quality of the second course. Derek said he would handle it. Ryan thanked him, and without looking back walked out through the front door and into the night air. His truck was where he had parked it 2 blocks down on a side street. He walked to it without hurrying. The city made its usual sounds around him, distant traffic, the low rhythm of a night that had no particular interest in what had just happened, inside one private dining room in one restaurant among hundreds. Ryan unlocked the door, got in, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Not to process anything dramatic, simply because it was quiet, and he had always found it easier to think in quiet. He started the truck and pulled into the street with the windows down despite the chill, because he preferred the cold air to the sealed quiet of the cab. Behind him in the private room at Meridian, the evening continued, because evenings do. Blake Harrison eventually said something that made Gerald Collins nod. Something about market conditions, or a recent acquisition, or any of the dozen topics men like them return to when they need solid ground beneath a conversation that has gone unsteady. Patricia Collins refilled her daughter's glass with the careful attention of a woman who understood that what had just happened could not be repaired tonight, and possibly not ever, but that the immediate task was to keep the table from collapsing entirely. Vanessa sat back in her chair and looked at the ownership documents still resting on the table near the empty seat where Ryan had been. She did not reach for them. She did not need to read them to understand what they said. She understood perfectly well, better, in fact, than she had understood anything about Ryan Carter in all the years she had spent deciding she already knew him. She did not have a word for what she felt. It was not grief exactly, and it was not humiliation exactly, though it contained elements of both. It was something more specific than either the particular feeling of having arranged a situation with great care, and then discovering that the foundation you built it on was not the foundation you thought it was, and that the person you had underestimated had always been quietly and without announcement, standing on entirely different ground. Claire Mercer, seated across from the empty chair, looked at the documents once, and then looked away. She had always been polite to Ryan at these gatherings, and she was now recalibrating what politeness had cost her in terms of actual attention. She thought about the question he had asked the server during the first course, specific technical proprietary, and understood now what it had been. Not curiosity. Verification. He had been checking the quality of his own kitchen from the far end of someone else's party, and none of them had understood what they were watching. In the months that followed, Ryan did what he had always done. He worked. He expanded the Carter Group by 2 properties, one in the financial district, one in a neighborhood that had been underserved by quality dining, and that he had been watching for 3 years. He hired well and paid well, and made decisions based on what he knew rather than what looked good from the outside. He gave a significant donation to a workforce development nonprofit that trained people for careers in the hospitality industry, which was something he had been doing quietly for years without publicizing it. The organization's director sent him a handwritten note after the gift came through. Ryan kept it in the top drawer of his office desk without framing it, which was exactly where he kept the things that actually meant something to him. He did not speak about Vanessa Collins publicly or privately, because there was nothing to say that the evening at Meridian had not already said more precisely than words could. He started spending more time with a small group of people he trusted, people who had known him before the success had compounded to its current scale, and people he had met more recently who had come to him without knowing what he was worth and had stayed because of something else. There was a woman named Sarah Whitfield who worked in urban planning and who had met Ryan at a community zoning meeting where he had shown up without identifying himself as anything other than a local property stakeholder. She was direct in a way that reminded him of what he valued in people. She asked hard questions without softening them first, and she listened to the answers with the kind of attention that doesn't have an agenda behind it. On the evening they first had dinner together at a restaurant that was not his, she had asked him 3 questions in a row that had nothing to do with his net worth or his company or his plans, and everything to do with what he actually thought about things. He had walked back to his car that evening with the particular lightness that comes from being seen accurately, and he had not taken it for granted. Vanessa Collins rebuilt her composure the way she rebuilt everything with discipline and forward motion. She and Blake Harrison attended several events together in the months after Meridian and the social world they moved in accepted the pairing with the ease of a community that prefers resolution over complication. She closed a significant deal for her company in the spring that received favorable coverage in 2 industry publications. From the outside, the arc of her life continued upward without visible interruption, but there were moments in the middle of a long day or in the first quiet minutes of a morning before the structure of work reasserted itself when she returned to the private room at Meridian in her memory. Not to the look on her family's faces when Judith Hale opened that folder. Not to Blake's carefully managed expression, or to her father's silence, or to the ownership documents sitting unclaimed on the table after Ryan had gone. She returned specifically to what Ryan had said when she had closed the distance between them. The thing about her never having thought to ask who he actually was. Not because he was hiding, because she had been so certain she already knew. That particular truth did not dissolve when the evening ended. It followed her into the spring and into the summer, quieter than guilt, but more persistent, the kind of recognition that, once arrived at, has no clean way out. She had spent years developing the ability to assess situations quickly and act on those assessments with confidence. It was one of the things that made her effective. It was also, she was beginning to understand, one of the ways she had caused the most damage without knowing it. Ryan drove home that Saturday night with the windows down, the cold air moving through the cab of the truck, the way it did on nights when he didn't need music or noise or anything except the road in front of him. He was not celebrating. He was not grieving. He was occupying the particular space that comes after something has been resolved, not happily, not bitterly, but cleanly, with nothing left unspoken and nothing left undone. He had wanted to see the full shape of the thing before he ended it, and he had seen it. He had wanted to say what was true rather than what was strategic, and he had said it. The rest wasn't his to carry. He had learned that years ago in a harder season than this one. Some losses teach you what you are made of. Some endings, if you let them teach you where to go next. Ryan Carter turned onto the highway and drove into the dark with the steadiness of a man who had always known exactly who he was and had simply been waiting with more patience than anyone had given him credit for the right moment to let it show.